Pirate Borg is a bit of a special case when it comes to Morkborg spinoffs. Ever since Morkborg came out, if you're not familiar, Morkborg is this sort of brash, rules light, in-your-face beer and pretzels game by Pelle Nilsson and Johan Nohr. Anyway, ever since it came out, along with its generous and brilliantly straightforward third-party license, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of Morkborg-based products. Every theme you can think of with the word Borg slapped at the end of the title. And let me just be frank with you right here. A lot of these Borg games and supplements were sort of low effort. And that's not to say that the creators of all these spin-off products didn't try. I'm sure a lot of them gave it their best, but their best just wasn't good enough to rise above the tsunami of other more interesting and diverse content in the RPG space. So with that in mind, in 2022, when Pirate Borg launched on Kickstarter, I gave it a glance and thought it had potential, but I was sort of Morkborged out at that point, and I wasn't all that into bog standard pirate fantasy stuff, and I just gave it a pass. Well, it's been a couple years, and what has happened is that the writer and illustrator of Pirate Borg, Luke Stratton, has proved not only to be a bona fide RPG creator committed to his original product, it turns out he's hitting all the notes that an indie RPG business person should make in order to actually make a living in this hobby. There are two things I want to walk you through in this video. The first is my long overdue standard review of the original Pirate Borg book, which is a standalone game that just uses the Morkborg rules paradigm. The second is a preview of the first Pirate Borg expansion on Kickstarter, which at the time of recording just launched. This video isn't sponsored or anything. I just happened to run into Luke and his crew at Gen Con this year, and when he was telling me about this expansion and all of the cool things that they have planned, I could just feel that he was on fire with creative inspiration. This stuff that they have planned is pretty exciting, and I want to share it with you. I'll make bookmarks in this video so that you can skip ahead to the crowdfund expansion if you're already familiar with the core Pirate Borg book. Anyway, first, let's look at the Pirate Borg core rulebook. I think the best place to start here is the default setting. You can run this game with pirates anywhere in the world, but the baseline is the Caribbean, roughly during the golden age of pirates. Except this is an alternate universe where the European explorers and colonizers began to arrive in this region, and they discovered emptied towns and cities. And eventually they came to realize that some kind of disease or scourge had recently ravaged all of the Caribbean islands. The scourge turned out to be something more than just a normal disease or pox. It was an epidemic of eldritch proportions, which spawned monsters and undead and dark magics. But instead of vacating the region for good, several foreign factions, as well as a few local ones, stuck around in this region. They did so because it turned out that if you grind up the bodies of the undead into powder, you can ingest the powder and experience all manner of a hallucinogenic effect, as well as the chance for complete ruin or supernatural powers. This substance, known as ash, became the bedrock of the economy and the hook that kept all manner of opportunist scum and hopeless junkie clinging to the region. Factions include the Brethren of the Coast, who are rebels, thieves, and vagabonds who sail, in a word, your standard pirates. The British, who exist here under the banner of the West India Company. By the way, I need to pause here and briefly discuss Pirates of the Caribbean. I never watched the movies before preparing for this video, so finally getting around to watching all 5 of these films was a maelstrom of overstimulation and annoyance and admiration. The first movie is really pretty great, and the rest of them are a mixed bag. My point is here, author Luke Stratton is very clearly inspired by the fantastical, dark, yet maybe slightly goofy motifs of Pirates of the Caribbean. He even thanks his mom for taking him on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland when he was a kid. But if you want to steer clear of this movie franchise when approaching Pirate Borg, you can graduate to another piece of media that Luke personally recommended to me, Black Sails, a TV show that ran for 4 seasons and which uses a much more violent, sober aesthetic that can easily be employed in a Pirate Borg game. That being said, Black Sails doesn't have the supernatural elements that Pirates of the Caribbean has, so I'm afraid you're going to have to watch all of this crap if you want the full media touchstone overload prior to running or playing a maximally informed game of Pirate Borg. Anywho, as far as factions in the game, you have the French, who, like the British, have been cut off from their mother country and exist as an independent vestige of the colonial power in the region. You have the Spanish, who represent New Spain in the region. As you can see from these Morkborg-style spreads, you don't get much information about these factions. It's more like brief paint strokes meant to inspire you to fill in the blanks. Like for Spain here, you just have to think in terms of keywords. Cuba, treasure fleets, a citadel, the Inquisition, yada yada yada. Good luck, GM. I hope you know your history or you've watched lots of pirate movies and shows. So I actually got to play a game of Morkborg run by the publisher's own marketing guy, Zach Goins. He's a great guy. We had a great time. But what's funny is that when he was warming us up for the session, he mentioned the Wretched as one of the factions. And it only then occurred to me that, yeah, the Wretched are in fact the faction of the undead and the monsters and all that. But the presentation in the book is so artistic and brash in that style that Johan Nohr has blessed us all with that I didn't even realize at the time that the Wretched were a faction. And you know what? There's actually no title on this page that indicates the Spanish as being the Spanish. So that's kind of rough for the uninitiated. It's important to note that the history and lore of the setting is loose. The GM is expected to cobble together their own timeline, maybe with the help of this rollable table. The general gist of it is that the dark forces are rising and the end of the world approaches. When Zach walked us through character creation, I was reminded of how fun these Morkborg games are. If they're designed well, then you end up with a scumbag PC that is so repugnant that it's actually funny. I don't really want to go through all the specifics of the mechanics except to note a few things. One is that you have a 3d6 down the line roll for your core stats, but then use the standard D&D modifiers as each stat and just throw out the base stat itself. The second is that there are only 5 core stats instead of the standard 6. And the third thing that bears mentioning is that you don't use agility for ranged attacks. Anytime you're shooting a gun, for example, you're actually using your presence stat. This rebalances the game a bit and actually puts a lot of importance in presence. There's nothing particularly innovative or novel about the combat mechanics in Pirate Borg. You're rolling a d20 plus stat and applicable modifiers to meet or exceed a target number. It's mostly pretty standard. One thing that I really enjoy seeing in games and in actual practice is the concept of the morale check, where enemies have a chance of fleeing during a fight at certain points. Fights to the death can drag on sometimes and not always make sense in the fiction. There are 6 classes to choose from, and they really do make a huge difference in how the game plays. The Brute is a melee-based fighter. By the way, each time you level up in this game, which is basically any time the GM wants you to, you get a shot at increasing a core stat, a bump in HP, and you gain one of 6 class features. With some classes, these features can stack, but with the Brute, they don't stack. If your Brute PC somehow, against all odds, survives past 6 level ups and you don't have any more class features to pick up, then the gentleman's agreement is that you get to choose a feature from another class. Rapscallions are rogues that require an actual or virtual deck of cards to play. I have to mention this again. I found the avant-garde layout to be an impediment in absorbing and referencing the rules on this spread in particular. So the 6 cards along the bottom are actually a d6 table, giving you the results of 1 to 6. And then the card on the top right is a d20 table that is associated with the drinking rule next to it. The top card is not associated with the bottom cards. That took me a second to work out. The Buccaneer is the class that I chose in my playthrough, and they're supposed to be gun experts. Muskets in the game deliver high damage but require 2 turns to reload, which means you really need to carry a whole bandolier of loaded guns into combat. But at least with the Buccaneer, it only takes 1 round to load. My Buccaneer had Survivalist as a starting ability, which made him impervious to all infection, sickness, and poison, which is to say, this game gives you a lot of pulpy, almost arcade-like powers and abilities. It's really meant to be played hard and fast. The Swashbuckler is another roguish fighter archetype. If you start with the Flintlock Fanatic fighting style, by the way, you can also reload in just 1 round instead of 2, like the Buccaneer. The Zealot is basically a cleric or priest type who uses prayer-based spells. There are 10 available prayers ranging from healing and cursing to controlling weather and casting light. Again, the layout goes a bit too far with this completely sideways text. By the way, this is supposed to be a d6 table that tells you which god or entity your zealot serves. Sorcerer is exactly that, and there are 6 spells, each with 3 levels. You start with 1 spell at level 1 and can gain either a new spell or a new level in an existing spell every time you level up. This felt a little sparse for me in terms of player options up front. The fact that your PC will not likely live past 6 or 7 levels means that you don't get to play with many spells in the course of a PC's lifespan. I would have liked to have seen more starting spells, which is something that you can homebrew, of course. There are a couple of optional classes that we didn't explore in my playthrough, the first of which is the Haunted Soul. These are added on to one of the 6 core classes, and honestly, this is where I started to sit up and really regard Pirate Borg as something special. You're not just PCs encountering and fighting the supernatural. By default, you can be a supernatural character of many different flavors. These are great options here, but it gets even more interesting. The so-called tall tale options allow you to assume the physiology of a mermaid, mutant, or one of 6 animals. Just think about that for a minute. You can play as a monkey in this game, or a parrot. I can see that being really annoying at the table, actually. Less is more with the voices, okay? There are a number of thoughtful tables that really add to the pirate theme, things that indicate real passion in this book. Sea shanties are songs that the crew of a ship can sing each day to gain one kind of boon or another. And the alchemy tables allow you to generate hundreds of thousands of different potions and concoctions. But maybe the crowning achievement of Pirate Borg is naval combat rules. I guess the best way to describe ship-to-ship combat in this game is that it's not super abstract, but it's not super detailed either. In terms of complexity and turn-by-turn methodology, it does stick out as more complicated than regular combat in the game. It's a completely different set of rules, but the complexity of it does do one thing, and that is scratch the itch of wanting to wage ship-to-ship combat in an RPG. I'm not going to go through all the actual rules, but I'll do you one better. Down in the description below, I've included a link to an excellent official tutorial by Limithron's quartermaster Tyler. He explains it completely in under 6 minutes, which tells you what you need to know about the actual complexity. There are actually 17 different boat and ship types in the book, and you get the very firm sense that ship combat is a game unto itself here, which is ideal actually, since the core Mork Borg rules just wouldn't cut the mustard. There are 30 animal enemies divided into 5 categories, as well as a monster generator here. I appreciate the sobriety in text presentation on these pages, and I wouldn't have faulted Luke for making the entire book look like this. Readability is important when you actually want to run a game. There are 7 types of skeleton enemies, which for the most part resemble what I would use for regular pirate enemies, except for the hilarious feature of collapsing into a pile of bones after taking 5 damage. Notice that since they're undead, they crumble into ash, that potentially very valuable narcotic that is traded in the region. 4 classes of zombies here, 4 classes of ghost enemies. Then there are 12 supernatural oddities, large and small. It was at this point that I realized that Luke Stratton is a very talented artist. The fact that he illustrated most of this book with a little help from archival museum images was very impressive. Sentient undead cannons called marrow cannons are a fun concept that you can play with on your ship. And there are 4 captain archetypes, each with a very distinct theme that I imagine would define the ship that they're captaining. If I were prepping a Pirate Borg game from scratch, I think I'd actually start with the captain of the main enemy ship, if there was such a ship in the story. There are 4 pages of tables to quickly generate ships at sea. The buried treasure table is fun. I really liked the treasure maps generator, but I did have one slight complaint. You get some really cool icons to use when drafting a treasure map for players, and these are great if you're going to go digital and you can just copy and paste them, but it would have been especially cool if these icons were all much simpler and reproducible by a non-illustrator such as myself. The Uncharted Island generator is great. Check it out. This was written by Jacob Hurst of Swordfish Island and Hot Springs Island fame. That's a pretty heavy hitter to bring in for a 2-page island spread. Nice job. The Jobs and Quests generator is decent. It probably could have been expanded to 4 or even 6 pages though. And finally, there's a sample adventure called The Curse of Skeleton Point that runs for about 32 pages or so that I won't spoil too much here. This castle looks awfully familiar. Although I do have to show you how clean and orderly the presentation of the scenario is. Just like in original Mork Borg fashion, the sample adventure gets serious about presenting information in a readable, usable format. And there are actually 10 10 different maps included in this scenario, detailing towns, caves, dungeons, and castles. It's a pretty impressive display of sample content. The index for the book has maximum sobriety and utility, and the quick reference rules at the very end are likewise extremely efficient and businesslike. It left me wondering if they're ever going to publish a bare bones text-only version of the game, the way that Mork Borg itself was eventually released. So the first big official expansion for Pirate Borg consists of a multitude of products, and like I mentioned, the Kickstarter just launched at the time that this video was released, so all I can show you here is what Limithron provided me thus far. The first thing on offer with this expansion is Down Among the Dead, a roughly 125-page supplement that contains a smorgasbord of different goodies. You've got a couple of new classes, a bunch of new skills, house rules. Let's jump to the house rules actually. In my playthrough, we actually used a couple of these rules, including re-rolling initiative each round, which made combat a bit more interesting and unpredictable. I think my favorite one here, and one which, mark my words, will act as the seed that will eventually blossom into a Pirate Borg convention of its own, is number 2 right here. Wearing a costume or hat in real life gives players the option of equipping their character with similar gear for free. If that doesn't get people to dress up as a pirate, I don't know what will. Well played, guys. Check out this island generator that uses all 7 polyhedrals. You just throw all the dice at once and boom, you have an island to explore. Lost to the Locker is the sort of major showpiece of this book, and it gives you guidance on how to run an adventure after all of the PCs have died. This is a potentially really fun concept where you can actually keep playing with the same characters even after a TPK. There are all kinds of tables and ideas for creating an afterlife adventure. More of that great artwork that we saw in the first book as well. Some new monsters to kill you a second time. And there are 8 area archetypes displayed in this format here. They give you sort of broad strokes so that you can design each of these areas yourself. This book also contains Venom in the Veins, a long-awaited adventure that takes players to the Yucatan Peninsula where they face off against some serpent folk. I love serpent folk, so this one is especially interesting to me. I don't want to spoil the adventure, but I do have to show you the way the dungeon is presented. If you recall the sample dungeon at the end of the original Mork Borg core book, portions of the main map were provided along with very easy to read and reference information like this. This is my absolute favorite format of GM facing dungeon presentation, so I'm very excited about running this adventure one day. The book has another major adventure called Into the Maelstrom, which was described to me as a pseudo dungeon crawl. Essentially, it's a dungeon adventure that takes place on a big ship, and there are about 30 different areas for your players to discover. The presentation, again, is very efficient and easy to use from a GM's perspective. So that's the Down Among the Dead book. This crowdfunding project also includes a much longer 180-page book called Cabin Fever, which will feature the best fan-submitted adventures collected over a period of time. I believe the beta PDF will be available to download for free, and all future proceeds of the book will be given to the creators or something. I can't wait to see what the fans came up with for this game. There are also dice sets, including a glow-in-the-dark set, a patch that I think was tastefully done, a Down Among the Dead coin. You can never have enough coins in a pirate game. And maybe one of the most exciting things of all, a starter box set. The way that Luke and later Zach described it to me was that they are shooting to include all the stuff you need for a sample adventure, but also a naval map and ship tokens so that you can jump right into that aspect of the game. This was in response to a lot of Pirate Borg fans not having the assets needed to immediately jump into a naval combat. So ultimately, this box is shooting to give you the whole Pirate Borg package. All right, here are my thoughts on Pirate Borg. Cons. Layout is challenging. I think from the perspective of subversive layout and standing out as an interesting book on a coffee table, the Johan Nohr school of RPG layout with its crooked text and hundreds of fonts is just great. But as a GM and a player and a reviewer of this material, I need to be able to read and parse out the information on the page because I have the objective of actually absorbing the information and using it. And for anyone who has these objectives, the Skater magazine approach to layout is a major roadblock. Short-lived PCs limit story. It's just the nature of Mork Borg games, but PCs don't live that long. In Pirate Borg, with classes like the Buccaneer and with Zealot healer powers, you can survive a decent ways into a story or campaign. But when the GM inevitably starts throwing Davy Jones and Kraken caliber enemies at you, PC's lives can and will eventually come to a grisly end, which means by default in this game you can't explore the more interesting aspects of a pirate story that come with longevity. At least there's the undead campaign concept coming out, which can sidestep this limitation a little. Factions could be fleshed out. I feel like there was a beat missed with the different factions only getting a couple of paragraphs each. They could have been a much more significant part of the game where players get bonuses and perks and maybe also penalties and misfortunes of one sort or another for belonging to one of these factions. That would have tied the characters to the broader tapestry of the setting a little more. There are a couple of things that I wish would get implemented in this game. The first is domain options. It would be cool to have maybe 4 pages dedicated to options on building a stronghold or a little citadel along a coastline. A place where your piratey PCs could store their booty and which could transcend PC deaths. That's one of the things I love about having a home base in RPGs. They tend to last longer than any one individual PC, which can be very satisfying for players in the long run. Dominion mode. Taking the idea even further, it would be cool to see a fillable hex map of the entire Dark Caribbean, or maybe portions of it, that can be divided into factional influence or ownership. This would require another set of rules, but it doesn't have to be too complicated. The idea would be just to have an overlay of broad considerations in the realm where factional dominance can be influenced by things as small as PC actions and victories. Pros. Inspired character creation and play options. I think the 6-core player archetypes are great, but when you throw in the supernatural add-ons and the tall tale options, the whole game is transformed into a very special pirate game that doesn't take itself too seriously. Naval Combat. Incidentally, this game takes naval combat very seriously, all without becoming a slog. It was the right choice to make naval combat more than just a few dice rolls here or there, because it is a lot more satisfying to actually have some tactics involved. Artwork conveys playful yet dark tone. I doff my tricorn hat at Luke for his many different and zany illustrations in the core book. He adopts many different art styles, but they all seem to work together to create a very approachable, like-hearted aesthetic of decrepit death and darkness. Model game support. This one really impressed me. When I went hunting for some naval maps and piratey encounter maps, my search actually led me directly to the Limithron Patreon account, where I found a couple of dozen free maps and other visual resources. On top of that, their Patreon at this point has released a dizzying amount of piratey encounter maps and ship tokens and other stuff for the game, all accessible if you join as a paid member. It was only after seeing all those hundreds of maps that I realized that Limithron sets the gold standard for supporting its game. It's clearly a passion for them, and players get the benefit of that passion in the form of seemingly endless maps and tokens to use in the game. Model community. To add on top of that, Pirate Borg's online community is also ideal. Their official Discord server is lively, friendly, and helpful. The creator and official stewards of Pirate Borg are also there to answer your questions and champion their game and just sustain the enthusiasm of gaming in general. It's the best you could ever hope for in a Discord server for a tabletop RPG. Expansions look promising. The Down Among the Dead book is chock full of fun new ideas for the game. The Cabin Fever fan adventures are going to be 180 pages of more adventure ideas, all cherry-picked from dozens and dozens of submissions, so they're essentially the best of the best out of a very sizable fan base. And the starter set looks good enough that I might just buy it for the naval map and ship tokens. Pirate Borg has turned out to be a pretty interesting game that has blossomed into every indie RPG creator's dream, a thriving community that actually plays the game. Limithron's marketing guy Zach told me that they had over 100 games officially run at Gen Con 2024, mostly in private rooms at the stadium. That is an extremely strong sign of success, not just sales numbers or crowdfund totals, but actual people running and playing the game. And I can tell you, I've played it, it's a lot of fun. I don't blame people for flocking to this game. I don't know how much actual work Luke and his team puts into the Limithron Patreon, which has now produced literally hundreds of maps and game assets. And I don't know how many hours they've spent moderating their Discord server or manning the Pirate Borg booth at countless conventions or writing and illustrating all these books. But I can tell you this is how much work is required to make a Mork Borg spinoff a wild success, just in case you were wondering. Let me know if you've played or run Pirate Borg and if you plan on backing the Kickstarter. Links are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.